At 3:47 in the morning, a janitor pushing a mop cart heard something that would prevent a blackout affecting 6 million people. But nobody believed him because everyone had already decided he didn't matter. This is the story of a man the world chose to ignore, until the night one billionaire CEO finally looked down and saw genius hiding behind a maintenance uniform. If you want to see how far this story travels, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to know where you're watching from. The alarm clock screamed at 5:12 a.m., same as it did every miserable morning. Ethan Ryder's hand shot out from under the thin blanket and slammed the snooze button hard enough to rattle the nightstand. For exactly 9 minutes, he lay there in the dark, staring at the water stains spreading across the ceiling of the apartment, thinking about how his life had become a series of sounds he couldn't stand. The alarm, the dripping faucet in the bathroom that the landlord refused to fix, the hum of the refrigerator that was probably going to die any day now, the neighbor upstairs who apparently wore concrete boots and never slept. 9 minutes. That's all he got. When the alarm went off again, Ethan sat up and pressed his palms against his eyes until he saw colors that weren't there. His back hurt. His shoulders hurt. Everything hurt in that dull, persistent way that came from doing work your body wasn't built for, night after night, for nearly 3 years. He was 32 years old, and he felt 50. The apartment was cold. October in Chicago meant the heat barely worked, and the landlord's definition of fixed usually involved duct tape and a shrug. Ethan pulled on the same jeans he'd worn yesterday, the same gray hoodie with the frayed cuffs, and walked quietly past the second bedroom where his daughter was still asleep. He stopped in the doorway. Chloe was 8 years old, curled up under a quilt his mother had made before she died. Her dark hair spread across the pillow, one arm flung over the side of the bed like she was reaching for something in a dream. She looked peaceful. Safe. Like the world hadn't touched her yet. Ethan stood there longer than he should have, just watching her breathe. She was the only reason he got up every morning, the only reason he didn't just give up and disappear. In the kitchen, he made instant coffee that tasted like burnt regret and ate 2 pieces of toast standing over the sink because sitting down felt like admitting the day had already started. The clock on the microwave blinked 5:34. He had 40 minutes before he needed to leave for Chloe's school drop-off, then another 30-minute train ride to work. Work. The word used to mean something different. Ethan Ryder used to be someone. Not famous, not rich, but respected. He'd been a rising systems engineer at Helix Energy Solutions, one of the top firms designing smart infrastructure across the Midwest. He'd been good at it, better than good. He could look at a power grid the way some people looked at sheet music, see the patterns, hear the rhythm, understand how everything connected before anyone else did. That was before he found the problem. It started small. A discrepancy in energy output reports. Numbers that didn't quite line up. At first, Ethan thought it was a software glitch, something he could fix over a weekend. But the deeper he looked, the worse it got. Someone inside Helix was manipulating grid data to overcharge municipalities by fractions of a percent, small enough that nobody noticed, large enough that over 5 years it added up to tens of millions of dollars. Ethan went to his supervisor. His supervisor told him to drop it. Ethan went to the compliance department. Compliance told him he was mistaken. So Ethan did the one thing he thought was right. He took the evidence to a federal regulator. 2 weeks later, he was fired for performance issues. 3 weeks after that, every job application he sent out came back with polite rejections or no response at all. Someone had made sure his name was poison in the industry, blacklisted, erased. Within 6 months, his savings were gone. Within a year, he was working overnight shifts as a janitor just to keep the lights on and Chloe in school. Now nobody even looked at him. He was invisible. At 6:15, Ethan woke Chloe up gently, the way he always did, with a hand on her shoulder and a quiet, "Hey kiddo, time to get moving." She groaned and pulled the blanket over her head. 5 more minutes. "You said that yesterday, and we were late." Mrs. Patterson didn't even notice. Mrs. Patterson notices everything. She's got eyes like a hawk. Chloe peeked out from under the blanket, squinting at him. "Do hawks even have good eyes?" "Better than yours before coffee." "I don't drink coffee." "Exactly." She smiled just a little, and Ethan felt the tightness in his chest ease slightly. He waited while she got dressed, made her a waffle that was only slightly burnt, and packed her a lunch that was probably not as healthy as it should have been, but was the best he could manage on $40 a week for groceries. They walked to the bus stop together. Ethan carrying her backpack because she claimed it was too heavy, even though he knew she just liked when he did it. The morning was gray and cold, the kind of weather that made you want to crawl back into bed and forget the world existed. Dad? Yeah? Are we still poor? Ethan's stomach dropped. He glanced down at her, but she wasn't looking at him. She was watching a man across the street unlock a shiny black car that probably cost more than Ethan made in 2 years. We're doing okay, he said carefully. Emma said her dad makes lots of money. She said that's why they went to Disney. Everyone's got different situations, Chloe. But we can't go to Disney. Not right now. Will we ever? Ethan didn't answer right away. He wanted to lie. He wanted to tell her that things were going to get better, that soon they'd have enough money for vacations and new clothes and everything she deserved. But he'd learned the hard way that promises he couldn't keep hurt worse than the truth. I don't know, he said quietly, but I'm working on it. She nodded, like that was enough, and didn't bring it up again. When the bus came, Ethan watched her climb the steps and find a seat near the back. She waved at him through the window, and he waved back until the bus disappeared around the corner. Then he stood there alone on the sidewalk, feeling like the worst father in the world. By 7:30, Ethan was on the Red Line heading south toward the industrial district where Vanguard Grid Systems sat like a fortress of steel and glass. The train was packed with people who looked just as tired as he felt. Construction workers, nurses coming off night shifts, students half asleep with their heads against the window. Nobody talked. Nobody made eye contact. Ethan stared at his reflection in the dark glass and barely recognized himself. 3 years ago, he used to wear tailored shirts and carry a leather briefcase. Now he wore a maintenance uniform with his name stitched over the chest pocket and carried a backpack that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals. He got off at Monroe, walked 4 blocks east, and entered Vanguard through the employee entrance in the back. The security guard at the desk, Marcus, an older guy who'd worked there for 15 years, he barely glanced up. Morning, Ryder. Morning. Cold out there? Yeah, always is. That was the extent of their conversation. Marcus went back to his phone, and Ethan swiped his badge, hearing the faint beep that meant he was clocked in for another shift. Vanguard Grid Systems was one of the most advanced infrastructure companies in the Midwest. They managed smart grid networks across 6 states, handled energy distribution for millions of people, and pioneered some of the most sophisticated cooling and monitoring systems in the industry. The building itself was a marvel of modern engineering. 30 floors of server rooms, labs, executive offices, and enough technology to run a small country. And Ethan cleaned it. He pushed a mop. He emptied trash cans. He wiped down desks that cost more than his rent. The night shift supervisor, a woman named Karen, who had the energy of someone who'd given up on life around 1997, handed him his assignment without looking up from her clipboard. Floors 12 through 18 tonight. Server corridor needs a full sweep. Don't touch anything that beeps. Got it. And Ryder? Yeah? Try not to take 6 hours this time. I don't care how thorough you are. Well, Ethan didn't respond. He just took his cart, mop, bucket, trash bags, cleaning solution that probably violated several environmental regulations, and headed for the elevator. The building was always quieter at night. During the day, it buzzed with engineers, analysts, executives in expensive suits talking loudly about optimization and market positioning. But after 8 p.m., most of them went home. The only people left were security, a few night shift engineers monitoring the systems, and the cleaning crew. People like Ethan, invisible people. He started on the 12th floor working methodically. Empty offices, conference rooms with whiteboards covered in equations he could have solved in his sleep, break rooms that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition. It was mindless work, which was almost a relief. He didn't have to think, didn't have to feel, just push the mop, empty the trash, move to the next room. But somewhere around 11 p.m., as Ethan was cleaning the hallway outside the restricted server corridor on the 14th floor, he heard it, a sound. It was faint, so faint that if the building's HVAC system had been running even slightly louder, he would have missed it entirely. But Ethan had spent years learning to listen to machines. Back when he was an engineer, he used to walk through server rooms and hear things nobody else could. The slight whine of a failing hard drive, the irregular click of a loose fan blade, the almost imperceptible hum that meant something was drawing more power than it should. He stopped moving. The sound came again. A faint, rhythmic ticking buried inside the cooling system's normal white noise. Ethan frowned. He set down his mop and walked slowly toward the server corridor entrance. The doors were locked. This was a restricted area, accessible only to senior engineers and system architects. But Ethan had emergency maintenance access. Technically, he was allowed in if there was a potential equipment issue. He hesitated. If he was wrong, he'd look like an idiot. Worse, he'd look like a janitor overstepping his role, and that was a good way to get fired. But if he was right, Ethan swiped his badge. The door clicked open. Inside, the server corridor was a long, narrow space lined with towering racks of humming machines. The air was cool, kept at a precise temperature by the advanced cooling system that regulated the entire network. Rows of blinking lights stretched into the distance, green and blue and amber, like a city at night. Ethan walked slowly between the racks, listening. There. Third row, halfway down. The ticking was louder here, hidden beneath the steady hum of the cooling fans. Ethan crouched down and pressed his ear close to the vent. The rhythm was off. Not by much, maybe half a second every 10 cycles. But it was there. A synchronization conflict. Ethan's heart started to beat faster. He pulled out his phone and opened the maintenance app that gave him limited diagnostic access. It took him 3 minutes to navigate through the system logs. But when he found it, his stomach dropped. The cooling system and the primary grid network weren't syncing properly. It was a tiny, almost invisible flaw buried so deep in the architecture that the monitoring software wasn't flagging it. But Ethan knew what it meant. If the cooling system drifted far enough out of sync, it would create a feedback loop. The servers would overheat. Safety protocols would kick in and start shutting down systems to prevent damage. But because the grid network relied on real-time data distribution, a sudden shutdown could trigger a cascade failure across the entire smart grid infrastructure. 6 states. Millions of people. Hospitals. Traffic systems. Water treatment plants. All of it could go dark. Ethan sat down on the cold floor, his back against the server rack, and stared at the screen of his phone. He should report this. He should call someone. But who? The night shift engineers barely knew his name. If he went to them with this, they'd probably think he was crazy. A janitor claiming to have found a flaw that their million-dollar monitoring systems missed? They'd laugh him out of the building. Or worse, they'd ignore him, and people would die. Ethan closed his eyes and took a slow breath. Then he made a decision. For the next 2 hours, Ethan Ryder stopped being a janitor. He pulled up the full system architecture, something he technically wasn't supposed to have access to, but maintenance credentials were always weaker than people thought, and traced the synchronization conflict back to its source. It was elegant in a terrible way. Someone had updated the cooling algorithm 6 months ago to improve efficiency, but they hadn't accounted for how it would interact with the grid network's real-time load balancing. The flaw had been sitting there, dormant, waiting. Ethan's hands moved across his phone screen, pulling up lines of code, running simulations in his head. He could see the solution clearly. It wasn't complicated, just a small adjustment to the cooling cycle timing, a slight offset in the sync protocol. He wrote the fix in 20 minutes, tested it 3 times. Then, hands shaking slightly, he pushed it live. The ticking stopped. Ethan sat there in the silence, listening to the steady, perfect hum of the cooling system, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like himself again, but he couldn't take credit for this. If anyone found out a janitor had accessed restricted systems and rewritten critical infrastructure code, he'd be fired immediately, probably arrested. So Ethan did the only thing he could. He deleted his notes, cleared the logs, erased every trace of his presence. Then he stood up, walked out of the server corridor, and went back to his mop. By 4 a.m., Ethan had finished his shift. He clocked out, nodded at Marcus, and walked back into the cold Chicago morning. He should have felt exhausted. Instead, he felt awake, because for the first time in 3 years, Ethan Ryder had done what he was meant to do. He'd solved a problem nobody else could see, and even though no one would ever know, it mattered. It mattered. 14 floors above the ground, in an executive office that overlooked the entire city, Victoria Sinclair sat at her desk reviewing system logs that made absolutely no sense. She was 30 years old, a billionaire, and the CEO of one of the most successful infrastructure companies in the country. She hadn't gotten there by ignoring things that didn't add up. And this didn't add up. At 11:47 p.m., the monitoring system had flagged a potential cooling anomaly. Minor, nothing critical. But at 2:16 a.m., the anomaly had disappeared. Just vanished. No error report. No engineer sign-off. Nothing. Victoria leaned back in her chair and tapped her fingers against the armrest. Someone had fixed it. But who? She pulled up the access logs and frowned. The only person in the server corridor during that time was an employee named Ethan Ryder, maintenance staff, a janitor. Victoria stared at the name for a long time. Then she reached for her phone and made a call. Security, I need you to pull surveillance footage from the 14th floor server corridor. Timestamp 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. She hung up and turned back to her computer screen, her mind already racing, because something told her that the man pushing a mop through her building was not what he seemed, and Victoria Sinclair had built an empire by trusting her instincts. The surveillance footage was grainy but clear enough. Victoria watched the timestamp tick forward as a man in a maintenance uniform pushed a cleaning cart down the 14th floor corridor. He moved slowly, methodically, like someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. There was nothing remarkable about him, just another night worker doing a job nobody else wanted. But then he stopped. Victoria leaned closer to the screen. The man set down his mop and stood completely still for nearly 30 seconds, his head tilted slightly to one side, like he was listening to something. Then he walked toward the server corridor entrance, hesitated, and swiped his badge. The camera inside the corridor was motion activated. It flickered on as the man entered, and Victoria felt something shift in her chest as she watched what happened next. He didn't look lost. He didn't look confused. He moved through the server racks like someone who knew exactly what he was looking for, crouched down beside a cooling vent, pulled out his phone. And then, for the next 2 hours, he sat on the floor typing with the kind of focus Victoria usually only saw in her senior engineers during a crisis. When he finally stood up and left, the servers were still running, but the anomaly was gone. Victoria replayed the footage 3 times, then pulled up Ethan Ryder's employment file. It was thin, almost insultingly thin, hired 3 years ago as overnight maintenance staff. No disciplinary issues, no complaints, punctual, quiet. The kind of employee who did his job and didn't cause problems. His previous work history showed a 2-year gap before Vanguard, and before that, a single line that made Victoria stop breathing. Systems engineer, Helix Energy Solutions. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called her director of operations. Michael, I need you to run a deep background check on someone. Ethan Ryder, maintenance staff. I want to know everything. Michael Chen had worked with Victoria long enough to know when she was onto something. He didn't ask questions. I'll have it by morning. I want it in 2 hours. Victoria, it's 4 in the morning. Then you'd better get started. She hung up and turned back to the surveillance footage, watching the janitor solve a problem that had stumped her entire engineering team. Who the hell was this guy? Ethan got home a little after 5, his body aching in ways that were starting to feel permanent. He unlocked the apartment door as quietly as possible, set his keys on the kitchen counter, and stood in the dark for a moment, just breathing. The adrenaline from earlier had worn off, replaced by the familiar weight of exhaustion. He'd spent the entire train ride home replaying what he'd done, second-guessing every decision. What if the fix didn't hold? What if he'd made things worse? What if someone traced the access logs back to him? But underneath the anxiety was something else. Something he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten what it was called. Purpose. For 2 hours tonight, he'd been useful. He'd been needed. He'd been the person he used to be before everything fell apart. Ethan walked into Chloe's room and stood in the doorway, watching her sleep. She'd kicked off her blanket again, one leg hanging off the side of the bed. He pulled the quilt back over her, tucked it around her shoulders, and kissed her forehead gently. "Love you, kiddo," he whispered. She didn't wake up. Ethan went to his own room, collapsed onto the bed fully clothed, and fell asleep within minutes. He dreamed about server rooms and equations written in light. At 7:15 a.m., Victoria's phone buzzed with an email from Michael. The subject line read, "You're not going to believe this." She opened it and started reading. 3 minutes later, she was pacing her office, phone pressed to her ear. "Michael, tell me you verified this." 3 separate sources. It's all true. Us. He was one of the lead engineers on the Midwest Grid Integration project. Not just lead. He designed half the underlying architecture. The guy was considered a rising star, top of his field. So what happened? Michael paused. That's where it gets complicated. He filed a whistleblower complaint against Helix Energy Solutions in late 2022, claimed they were manipulating billing data to overcharge municipal clients. 2 weeks later, he was terminated for performance issues. After that, his career just vanished. Victoria stopped pacing. Was the complaint legitimate? There was an internal investigation, but it was closed without any findings. Helix claimed the discrepancies were clerical errors that had already been corrected. Ryder's complaint was dismissed as unfounded. And now he's cleaning floors for $18 an hour. Victoria sat down slowly, her mind racing. What about his education? Master's degree in systems engineering from MIT. Graduated top 10% of his class. Published 2 papers on smart grid optimization before he was 30. He was being recruited by half the major firms in the industry, and they all turned him down after Helix fired him. Blackballed. Happens more than people want to admit. Once you get labeled a troublemaker, especially in a specialized field, doors close fast. Victoria stared at her computer screen, at the frozen image of Ethan Ryder crouched beside a server rack, and felt something she hadn't expected. Anger, not at him, at the system that had thrown away someone brilliant because he'd told the truth. Michael, I want him in my office tomorrow morning. Victoria, he works night shift. He's probably asleep right now. Then wake him up. You can't just summon a janitor to the executive floor. It's going to raise questions. I don't care. Find him. Bring him here. Tell him it's not optional. She hung up before Michael could argue and sat back in her chair, fingers steepled under her chin. If Ethan Ryder was half as good as his files suggested, she'd just found the answer to a problem she'd been trying to solve for 6 months. And if he wasn't, she'd at least get an explanation for how a maintenance worker had outsmarted her entire engineering department. Either way, this was going to be interesting. Ethan woke up to his phone ringing at 1:30 in the afternoon. He grabbed it blindly, still half asleep, and squinted at the screen. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him swipe to accept. Hello? Mr. Ryder, this is Michael Chen, Director of Operations at Vanguard Grid Systems. Ethan sat up fast, suddenly very awake. Yeah, this is Ethan. I'm calling on behalf of Victoria Sinclair. She'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning at 9. Ethan's stomach dropped. I work nights. I'm not scheduled during the day. This isn't about your maintenance schedule. Ms. Sinclair wants to speak with you personally regarding a separate matter. What matter? She'll explain when you get here. 9th floor executive suite. Don't be late. The line went dead. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone, his heart pounding. They knew. Somehow, they knew what he'd done. He was going to get fired. Probably worse. They'd call it unauthorized access, systems tampering, maybe even sabotage if they wanted to make an example of him. He'd lose his job, his income, the tiny thread of stability that was keeping him and Chloe afloat. Ethan put his head in his hands and tried to breathe. By the time Chloe got home from school, Ethan had convinced himself that panicking wasn't going to help. He made her a snack, listened to her talk about some drama involving a boy named Tyler who'd apparently stolen someone's eraser, and tried to act normal. But she noticed. Dad, you okay? Yeah, kiddo, just tired. You're always tired. That's what happens when you get old. You're not old. Mr. Patterson is old. He's like 100. Mr. Patterson is 45 and... That's old. Ethan smiled despite himself. Eat your apple slices. They're brown. They're fine. They taste weird when they're brown. Chloe. She sighed dramatically and took a bite, chewing like it was the greatest hardship ever inflicted on a human being. That night, Ethan barely slept. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, running through every possible scenario. Best case, they wanted to ask him some questions and then let him go back to work. Worst case, he'd be escorted out by security and never allowed back in the building. He thought about just not showing up, but that would only make things worse. At 8:45 the next morning, Ethan stood outside Vanguard Grid Systems wearing the only button-down shirt he still owned that didn't have a stain on it. His hands were shaking slightly, so he shoved them in his pockets. Marcus looked up from the security desk, surprised. Ryder, you're here early. Got a meeting. With who? Victoria Sinclair. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. The CEO? Yeah. What'd you do, find a dead body in a trash can? Ethan tried to smile. Something like that, Meg. He took the elevator to the 9th floor, watching the numbers climb, feeling like he was riding toward his own execution. The executive suite was everything the maintenance floors weren't. Polished marble, glass walls, expensive furniture that probably cost more than Ethan's car. A receptionist who looked like she'd never had a stressful day in her life smiled at him. Mr. Ryder? Yeah, sir. Miss Sinclair is ready for you. Follow me. She led him down a hallway and stopped outside a large office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Through the glass, Ethan could see a woman standing with her back to the door, looking out at the city. The receptionist knocked lightly. Mr. Ryder is here. Send him in. Ethan stepped inside and the door closed behind him with a soft click. Victoria Sinclair turned around, and Ethan's first thought was that she looked younger than he'd expected. Mid-30s, maybe. Sharp features, dark hair pulled back, eyes that missed nothing. Mr. Ryder, have a seat. Ethan sat in the chair across from her desk, feeling like a kid called to the principal's office. Victoria sat down and folded her hands on the desk, studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away. Do you know why you're here? I have a guess. Then let's skip the part where we pretend. 3 nights ago, you accessed a restricted server corridor and made unauthorized changes to our cooling system architecture. Is that accurate? Ethan's throat was dry. Yes. Why? Because it was going to fail. Victoria's expression didn't change. Explain, Ging. Ethan took a slow breath. I heard an irregular sound in the cooling fans. The synchronization timing was off by half a second. It was small, but it was there. If it drifted far enough, the cooling system would have caused a feedback loop with the primary grid network. You would have had a cascade failure across 6 states. And you determined this by listening. Yes. Our monitoring systems didn't flag it. Your monitoring systems weren't listening for it. Victoria leaned back in her chair. My senior engineers spent 2 weeks trying to optimize that cooling system. Are you telling me they missed something a janitor found in 2 minutes? Ethan met her eyes. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm telling you. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Victoria pulled up something on her computer screen and turned it toward him. Is this your work history? Ethan looked at the file. His file. Every job, every degree, every published paper. And right there at the bottom, the termination from Helix Energy Solutions. Yes. You were a systems engineer. I was. So what happened? Ethan's jaw tightened. I found a problem. I reported it, and I got fired. What kind of problem? The kind that made people a lot of money. Victoria studied him for a moment longer, then closed the file. I looked into the whistleblower complaint you filed. Helix claimed it was unfounded. They lied. Can you prove that? No. That's why I'm cleaning floors now. Victoria stood up and walked over to the window, her back to him. You know what I find interesting, Mr. Ryder? You could have walked away. 3 nights ago, when you heard that sound, you could have ignored it, finished your shift, gone home. Nobody would have known. People would have died. Maybe. But that wasn't your responsibility anymore. You're not an engineer. You're a janitor. Ethan felt anger flare in his chest. I'm still the same person I was 3 years ago. The job title doesn't change that. Victoria turned around, and for the first time she smiled. No, it doesn't. She walked back to her desk and pulled out a folder. I'm going to offer you a choice, Mr. Ryder. You can go back to your maintenance job, forget this conversation ever happened, and continue cleaning floors for the rest of your career. Or you can take a position as a systems architect under my direct supervision, effective immediately. Ethan stared at her. What? You heard me. You're offering me a job? Just like that? Not just like that. I've spent the last 24 hours reviewing everything you've ever worked on. You're brilliant. You're also unemployable, which means I can probably get you for a fraction of what you're actually worth. It's a good deal for both of us. Ethan's head was spinning. I don't understand. Why would you do this? Because I need someone who can see problems before they become catastrophic. Someone who doesn't care about politics or protecting people's egos. Someone who will tell me the truth, even when it costs them everything. She sat down and slid a piece of paper across the desk. That's the offer. Salary, benefits, the whole package. Look it over. Take your time. Ethan picked up the paper with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The number at the bottom made him forget how to breathe. It was more than he'd made at Helix, more than he'd ever thought he'd make again. This is fair, Victoria said simply. And if you prove yourself, it'll go up. Ethan looked at her, searching for the catch. What do you want from me? I want you to do what you did 3 nights ago. Find problems, fix them. Don't wait for permission. Don't ask if it's your job. Just do it. And if I screw up, then you're fired, same as anyone else. Ethan set the paper down, his mind racing. This didn't make sense. People didn't just get second chances like this. Not in the real world. Not after being blacklisted. I need to think about it. Victoria raised an eyebrow. You need to think about whether you want to stop cleaning toilets and go back to doing what you're actually good at. I have a daughter. I need to make sure I can take care of her before I make any decisions. Something shifted in Victoria's expression. How old? 8. What's her name? Chloe. Victoria nodded slowly. Here's what I'll do. Take a week. Get your childcare figured out. Make whatever arrangements you need. The offer stands until then. Ethan stood up, still holding the paper. Why are you doing this? Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Because 3 years ago, you did the right thing, and it destroyed your life. I'm not interested in punishing people for having integrity. The world does enough of that already. She walked him to the door and opened it. One more thing, Mr. Ryder. When you come back, don't come back as someone who's grateful. Come back as someone who knows what he's worth. Ethan stepped into the hallway, his legs barely working. Behind him, Victoria's door closed with a quiet click. He stood there for a long time, staring at the piece of paper in his hands, trying to convince himself this was real. Ethan didn't go home right away. He walked. Just walked through downtown Chicago with no destination in mind, the offer letter folded in his jacket pocket like a live wire. His phone buzzed. A text from the school. Chloe's teacher wants to schedule a parent meeting. Can you come in Thursday at 3? Ethan stared at the message. Thursday at 3. He worked nights, so technically he could make it. But that was before. If he took this job, everything would change. His schedule, his income, his entire life. He texted back, I'll be there. Then he kept walking. By the time he got home, it was nearly noon. Chloe wouldn't be back from school for another 3 hours. Ethan sat at the kitchen table and spread out the offer letter, reading it over and over like the words might change if he looked away. There were details he'd missed the first time. Health insurance, dental, a signing bonus that would cover 2 months of rent, retirement matching, things he'd stopped thinking about years ago because they felt like luxuries for a different kind of person. But there was something else buried in the fine print, a clause about intellectual property rights, non-compete agreements, and confidentiality obligations. Standard stuff. But it reminded him of why he'd lost everything the first time. He'd signed a contract like this at Helix, and when he'd tried to do the right thing, that contract had been used against him. What if this was the same? What if he took the job, found another problem, and history repeated itself? Ethan pushed the paper away and put his head in his hands. He wanted to believe Victoria Sinclair was different, but believing people had cost him everything once already. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running scenarios in his head. What if he took the job and failed? What if he couldn't keep up with engineers who'd been working in the field while he'd been pushing a mop? What if they resented him for getting hired without going through the normal process? What if Chloe got sick and he couldn't take time off? What if the whole thing was a mistake? At 3 a.m., he got up and went into the kitchen, made coffee, sat at the table in the dark. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. Ethan pulled out his phone and opened an old folder of photos he hadn't looked at in over a year. Pictures from before. Him at his desk at Helix, grinning at the camera. Him at a conference in Seattle, standing in front of a presentation slide with his name on it. Him and Chloe at Navy Pier, her sitting on his shoulders, both of them laughing. He looked happy. He looked like someone who had a future. Ethan closed the folder and set his phone down. He'd spent 3 years trying to survive, trying to keep his head down and make it through one day at a time. He'd convinced himself that was enough, that as long as Chloe was safe and fed, nothing else mattered. But it did matter, because every time she asked if they were still poor, every time she watched other kids talk about vacations and new bikes and birthday parties at places that cost money, Ethan saw the same thing in her eyes. She was learning to expect less, and that was worse than anything Helix had done to him. When Chloe came home from school the next day, Ethan was waiting at the kitchen table. "Hey, kiddo." "Hi, Dad." She dropped her backpack on the floor and opened the fridge. "Can I have juice?" "Sure. Come sit with me for a minute first." She poured herself a cup and sat down across from him, swinging her legs under the chair. "Am I in trouble?" "No, I just need to talk to you about something." "Is it about Tyler? 'Cause I didn't punch him. I just told him he was being dumb." "It's not about Tyler. It's about work." Chloe took a sip of juice. "You got fired?" "No, the opposite. Actually, I got offered a new job." Her eyes widened. "A real job?" Ethan smiled despite himself. "Yeah, a real job." "Doing what?" "The same thing I used to do. Engineering. Working with computers and systems and stuff you'd probably think is boring." "Is it more money?" "A lot more money." "Gaiti." Chloe set down her cup. "Does that mean we're not poor anymore?" Ethan's chest tightened. "It means things are going to get better." "Can we go to Disney?" "Maybe, someday." "Can I get new shoes? Mine have a hole." Ethan looked down at her sneakers and felt something crack inside him. He hadn't even noticed. "Yeah, kiddo, you can get new shoes." Chloe smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made every terrible thing he'd been through feel worth it. "When do you start?" I don't know yet. I wanted to talk to you first. It's going to mean some changes. Different schedule? Maybe some late nights. I'll need to figure out who's going to watch you when I'm working. I can stay with Mrs. Kim. Mrs. Kim was their downstairs neighbor, a 70-year-old woman who sometimes watched Chloe when Ethan worked double shifts. She was kind, but Ethan hated asking for favors. "We'll figure something out, but I need to know you're okay with this." Chloe looked at him seriously. "Do you want the job?" Ethan hesitated. "Yeah, I do." "Then you should take it. It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because I'm terrified," Ethan thought. "Because the last time I tried to be someone important, I lost everything. Because I don't know if I can do this again." But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he said, "Because I want to make sure it's the right choice for both of us." Chloe reached across the table and put her small hand on top of his. "Dad, you're really smart. Like, really, really smart. You should do smart people stuff, not cleaning stuff." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "You think so?" "Yeah, and also, I want new shoes." He laughed, and it felt good. It felt normal. "Okay, I'll take the job." "Good. Can we have pizza tonight?" "We literally had pizza 2 days ago." "So?" "So you're going to turn into a pizza?" "I wish." Ethan stood up and pulled her into a hug, holding on maybe a little longer than necessary. "Love you, kiddo." "Love you too. Can you let go now? You're squishing me." He let her go, and she ran off to her room, already back to being 8 years old and unconcerned with the weight of adult decisions. Ethan stayed in the kitchen, staring at the offer letter on the table. Then he pulled out his phone and typed a message to the number Michael Chen had called from. "I'm in. When do I start?" The response came back within 2 minutes. "Monday, 8 a.m. Don't be late." Ethan sat down slowly, his hands still shaking. He just made a decision that was either going to save his life or destroy what little he'd managed to rebuild. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he was moving forward instead of just surviving, and that had to count for something. On Monday morning at 7:45, Ethan stood outside Vanguard Grid Systems wearing clothes he'd bought at a thrift store the day before. The shirt was slightly too big and the pants were slightly too short, but it was the best he could do on short notice. He looked like someone pretending to be professional, and he felt like an imposter. His phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Kim downstairs. Chloe got on the bus fine. Good luck today. Ethan texted back a quick thank you and shoved the phone in his pocket. His hands were sweating. He wiped them on his pants and walked toward the entrance he'd only ever used at night. The lobby during the day was a different world. People in expensive suits moved through the space with purpose, their shoes clicking on the marble floor. Nobody looked at him. But unlike before, when he'd been invisible because he was maintenance staff, now he was invisible because he looked like he didn't belong. Ethan took the elevator to the 9th floor, his stomach twisting into knots. When the doors opened, the same receptionist from before looked up and smiled. Mr. Ryder, Miss Sinclair's expecting you. He followed her down the hallway, past offices filled with people who all seemed to know exactly what they were doing, and stopped outside Victoria's door. The receptionist knocked once. He's here. Send him in. Ethan stepped inside and found Victoria standing at her desk, reviewing something on her tablet. She looked up, and her eyes swept over him quickly, taking in the ill-fitting clothes and the nervous energy he was trying to hide. You're early. That's good. I didn't want to be late. Sit. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. We need to go over a few things before I introduce you to the team. Ethan sat, feeling like he was back in that meeting a week ago when he thought he was about to be fired. Victoria set down her tablet and looked at him directly. First thing, I hired you because you're good at what you do. Not because I feel sorry for you. Not because I'm trying to make up for what happened at Helix. You're here because I need someone with your skill set. Understand? Yes. Second thing, this is not going to be easy. Half the engineering department is going to resent you for getting hired without going through the normal interview process. The other half is going to assume you're only here because I felt like doing charity work. You're going to have to prove yourself every single day. Ethan nodded. I know. Third thing, if you find a problem, I want to know about it immediately. I don't care if it makes someone look bad. I don't care if it's politically inconvenient. You report directly to me, which means you bypass the usual chain of command. That's going to piss people off. Deal with it. Okay. Victoria leaned back in her chair. Any questions? Yeah. Why are you really doing this? She raised an eyebrow. I already told you. Shay? You told me you need someone who can find problems, but you've got an entire department full of engineers. What makes you think I'm different? Victoria was quiet for a moment, studying him. Because most engineers are afraid of being wrong. They'll run something through a dozen simulations and 3 rounds of peer review before they're willing to commit to a decision. You didn't do that. You heard a problem, you fixed it, and you didn't wait for permission. That's what I need. That's also what got me fired last time. I'm not Helix. How do I know that? Victoria's expression hardened slightly. You don't. You're going to have to trust me. And if I betray that trust, you can walk away and tell everyone I'm exactly like the people who screwed you over. But until then, I expect you to do your job. Ethan held her gaze. There was no warmth in it, but there was something else. Something that felt like honesty. Fair enough. Victoria stood up. Let's go meet your new team. She led him out of her office and down a different hallway to a large open workspace filled with desks, monitors, and people who all looked way too young and way too confident. At the front of the room was a glass-walled conference space where 5 people sat around a table talking over each other. Victoria opened the door without knocking, and the conversation stopped immediately. Morning, this is Ethan Ryder. He's joining the systems architecture team as of today. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward Ethan, and he felt his stomach drop. A man in his early 40s with graying hair and an expression that suggested he'd already decided Ethan was a waste of time spoke first. Ryder, that name sounds familiar? He used to work at Helix, Victoria said smoothly. Before that, he was part of the Midwest Grid Integration Project. The man's eyebrows went up. That was 8 years ago. 9, Ethan corrected quietly. So what have you been doing since then? Victoria cut in before Ethan could answer. That's not relevant. What's relevant is that he's here now, and he's going to be working with all of you on infrastructure optimization. I expect you to bring him up to speed. A woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled into a tight bun looked skeptical. We're in the middle of a critical deployment phase. Training someone new right now is going to slow us down. Then don't train him. Just give him access and let him figure it out. The woman blinked. You're serious? Completely. Nobody said anything for a moment, said. Then a younger guy with a beard and a faded band t-shirt under his button-up leaned back in his chair. What's your specialty? Grid synchronization, Ethan said. Cooling architecture. Load balancing. Ever work with real-time data distribution at scale? Well, yeah. I designed the protocol Helix used for cross-state energy management. The bearded guy looked impressed despite himself. That protocol's still in use. It's pretty solid. Thanks. The older man who'd spoken first folded his arms. Victoria, can I speak with you outside? No. Whatever you want to say, you can say it here. His jaw tightened. Fine. We've been operating as a tight team for 3 years. Bringing in someone from outside, especially someone who's been out of the industry for this long, is a risk. I don't think it's a good idea. Noted. Anything else? I'd like to know why you're making this decision without consulting the team. Victoria's expression didn't change. Because it's my company, Robert, and I don't need permission to hire people I think are valuable. Robert's face flushed, but he didn't say anything else. Victoria turned to Ethan. Your desk is the one by the window. Credentials are already set up. If you need anything, ask. Then she looked at the rest of the team. Make this work. She left without waiting for a response. The room was silent for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then the woman with the dark hair sighed. Well, this is going to be fun. Ethan's first week was brutal. He sat at his desk trying to catch up on 3 years of changes in protocols, software updates, and system architecture while the rest of the team worked around him like he wasn't there. Nobody was outright hostile, but nobody was helpful either. When he asked questions, he got short, clipped answers. When he offered suggestions, people nodded politely and then ignored him. Robert, the older engineer who'd questioned Victoria in that first meeting, made it clear he thought Ethan was dead weight. He didn't say it directly, but he didn't have to. Every time Ethan spoke up in a meeting, Robert would respond with something like, "That's an interesting thought, but we've already tried that approach." Or, "I'm not sure you have enough context to understand why that won't work." After 3 days, Ethan stopped talking in meetings. He focused on the work instead. Victoria had given him access to the full system architecture, and he spent hours going through it, looking for inefficiencies, potential failure points, anything that didn't make sense. And he found things. Small things, mostly. A redundancy protocol that was running twice as often as it needed to. A monitoring script that was pulling data from the wrong server cluster. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to slow the system down incrementally. On Thursday afternoon, Ethan wrote up a report detailing the issues and sent it to Robert. Robert responded an hour later with a single line. Thanks, we'll look into it. Ethan never heard about it again. By Friday, he was starting to wonder if he'd made a massive mistake. He left the office at 6, exhausted and frustrated, and took the train home. Chloe was waiting at Mrs. Kim's apartment downstairs, and when he knocked, she opened the door with flour on her face. Dad, we made cookies. Mrs. Kim appeared behind her, smiling. She's a very good helper. Thanks for watching her. It's no problem. She told me about your new job. Very exciting. Ethan forced a smile. Yeah, exciting. Upstairs, Chloe showed him the container of cookies she'd made, talking nonstop about her day at school. Ethan tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting back to the office, to the way Robert had dismissed his report, to the way the rest of the team treated him like a temporary inconvenience. Dad, you're not listening. Ethan blinked. Sorry, kiddo. What'd you say? I said Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you can come to the parent thing next week. What parent thing? The fall thing. With the projects and stuff. Ethan vaguely remembered getting an email about it. Yeah, I'll be there. Promise? Promise. She smiled and went back to talking about cookies, and Ethan tried to shake off the feeling that he was failing at everything. On Monday of the second week, Victoria called Ethan into her office. He walked in expecting bad news. Maybe she'd realized hiring him was a mistake. Maybe Robert had complained. Maybe this whole thing was about to fall apart. Instead, Victoria gestured to a chair. "Sit. I want to talk about your first week." "It was fine. Don't lie to me." Ethan sighed. "It was rough. Robert's been giving you a hard time. He's been giving me the silent treatment mostly." Victoria's jaw tightened. "He does that with people he doesn't think belong. It's unprofessional, but it's not going to change unless you give him a reason to respect you. I sent him a report on system inefficiencies. He ignored it. Did you send it to me?" "No, I thought I was supposed to go through the team lead." "You report to me, Ethan, not Robert. If you find something, I want to see it." "Chotem." Ethan pulled out his phone and forwarded her the report. "It's not a big deal, just some optimization stuff." Victoria read through it, her expression shifting from neutral to focused. When she finished, she looked up. This would improve system response time by about 12%. Probably closer to 15 if you implement all of it. And Robert ignored this? He said they'd look into it. Victoria's eyes narrowed. He didn't look into anything. He buried it because it came from you. She stood up and walked to her desk, typing something quickly on her computer. A minute later, she turned back to Ethan. "I just sent your report to the entire engineering team with a directive to implement it by end of week. Robert's going to be furious, but he'll get over it." Ethan felt a surge of anxiety. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. You're not here to be ignored. You're here to make this company better. If people can't handle that, they can find another job. You're going to make enemies doing this." "What?" Victoria smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "I already have enemies, Ethan. A few more won't kill me." By Wednesday, the entire engineering department knew about the report. Some people seemed genuinely impressed. Others looked at Ethan like he'd committed treason by going over Robert's head. Robert himself didn't speak to Ethan for 3 days. But on Thursday afternoon, something changed. Ethan was at his desk reviewing a load balancing protocol when one of the younger engineers, a woman named Maya, walked over and sat down in the empty chair next to him. "Hey, you got a minute?" Ethan looked up, surprised. "Yeah, what's up?" "I was looking at your optimization report. The part about the redundancy protocol? That's actually kind of genius. It's just basic efficiency. Maybe, but nobody else caught it. I've been staring at that code for 6 months, and it never occurred to me that we were running it twice." Ethan shrugged. "Sometimes you're too close to something to see it." Maya smiled. "Well, thanks. It's going to save us a lot of processing power." She started to leave, then turned back. "Also, just so you know, not everyone here thinks you're an outsider. Some of us are glad you're here." "Thanks. Robert's just territorial. He'll come around eventually, or he won't. Either way, don't let him get to you." After she left, Ethan sat back in his chair and felt something he hadn't felt since he started. Hope. The next week, Victoria assigned Ethan to a project reviewing the grid network's emergency shutdown protocols. It was tedious work, the kind of thing nobody wanted to do because it involved reading through thousands of lines of code looking for potential failure points. Ethan loved it. He spent 3 days buried in the protocols, taking notes, running simulations, testing edge cases. And on the 4th day, he found something that made his blood run cold. There was a flaw in the emergency shutdown sequence. A small one, but catastrophic if it ever triggered. If the system detected a sudden drop in power across multiple nodes simultaneously, it would initiate a cascading shutdown to prevent damage. But the shutdown sequence didn't account for partial grid failures. If only some nodes went down while others stayed online, the system would interpret it as a full failure and shut down everything, including backup systems that were supposed to stay active. It was the kind of thing that would never happen under normal circumstances. But if there was a cyber attack or a targeted infrastructure failure, or even a bad storm that hit the wrong nodes in the wrong order, it could trigger a blackout that would take days to recover from. Ethan stared at the code, his heart pounding. Then he picked up his phone and called Victoria. "I found something." "How bad?" "Bad enough that we need to fix it immediately." "I'll be right there." 10 minutes later, Victoria was standing at his desk with Robert and 2 other senior engineers. Ethan walked them through the flaw, explaining the shutdown sequence step by step. When he finished, Robert looked pale. How did we miss this? Because it's buried in a subsystem that almost never gets triggered, Ethan said. You'd have to be specifically looking for it. One of the other engineers, a guy named David, shook his head. If this had triggered during a real emergency, we would have been screwed. Victoria looked at Ethan. Can you write a fix? Already did. It just needs to be tested and deployed. How long? 2 days if we prioritize it. Victoria turned to Robert. Make it happen. Robert hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, okay, I see him. As everyone dispersed, Victoria stayed behind. She looked at Ethan for a long moment, then said quietly, This is the second time you've saved this company from a disaster nobody else saw coming. Just doing my job. No, you're doing more than that. She paused. I'm putting you in charge of system integrity review. Full authority to audit any part of the infrastructure. Report directly to me. Ethan's eyes widened. That's going to piss off a lot of people. I don't care. You've earned it. She left before he could argue. Ethan sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over him. He wasn't invisible anymore. That night, Ethan got home late. Chloe was already asleep, curled up on the couch with a book on her chest. He picked her up carefully and carried her to bed, tucking the blanket around her. As he stood in the doorway watching her sleep, his phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. Good work today. Ethan stared at the message for a moment, then typed back. Thanks. He set his phone down and walked into the kitchen, feeling exhausted but also something else. Proud. For the first time in years, he felt like he was building something instead of just surviving. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The following Monday, Ethan was in the middle of reviewing another protocol when Maya stopped by his desk again. Hey, you hear about the team meeting? Ethan looked up. What meeting? Robert called one. Mandatory attendance. Conference room in 10 minutes. Ethan's stomach sank. Did he say what it's about? Nope. But he looked pissed. Ethan saved his work and headed to the conference room where the rest of the team was already gathering. Robert stood at the front, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When everyone was seated, Robert cleared his throat. I wanted to address something that's been happening over the past few weeks. There's been some concern about the way certain decisions are being made without consulting the team. Ethan felt every eye in the room turn toward him. Robert continued, I understand that Victoria has given Ethan authority to audit our systems. And I understand that he's found some legitimate issues. But this team has been working together for years, and suddenly we're being told to implement changes without any discussion or input. That's not how we operate. Maya spoke up. The changes Ethan suggested have been solid. I don't see the problem. The problem, Robert said tightly, is that we're supposed to function as a team, not as individuals taking orders from someone who's been here for 2 weeks. Another engineer, a quiet guy named Sam, raised his hand. I mean, he did find the shutdown flaw. That could have been really bad. I'm not disputing that he's competent, Robert said. I'm disputing the process. Ethan had been sitting quietly, but now he spoke up. If there's a problem with how I'm doing things, just tell me. Robert looked at him. The problem is that you're bypassing the people who've been doing this work long before you showed up. You don't collaborate. You don't ask for input. You just find something, report it to Victoria, and we get an email telling us to fix it. That's not teamwork. I sent you a report last week. You ignored it. I didn't ignore it. I was evaluating it. For a week? Robert's face flushed. I have other priorities. And I have a job to do. If there's a flaw in the system, I'm not going to sit on it while you decide whether it's worth your time. The room went silent. Robert took a breath. Look, I'm not trying to make this personal, but if we're going to work together, there has to be mutual respect. That means you need to trust that the rest of us know what we're doing. Gate. Ethan stood up. I do trust you, but I also trust what I see. And what I've seen so far is a lot of good work and a few critical gaps that nobody caught. If pointing that out makes me the bad guy, then I guess I'm the bad guy. He walked out of the conference room, his heart pounding. Behind him, he heard Maya say, "Well, that went great. What? Great?" Ethan went back to his desk and tried to focus on work, but his hands were shaking. He just made things worse. Robert was never going to respect him now. Half the team probably thought he was arrogant, and Victoria was going to hear about this within the hour. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, his phone rang. Victoria's name on the screen. He answered, "Yeah, my office. Now." Ethan took the elevator to the 9th floor, feeling like he was walking toward his own execution again. When he stepped into Victoria's office, she was standing at the window, arms crossed. "Sit." He sat. Victoria turned around and her expression was unreadable. "Robert just called me, said you walked out of a team meeting." "I didn't walk out. I left after I said what I needed to say." "Which was?" "That I'm not going to apologize for doing my job." Victoria studied him for a moment. "You know what your problem is, Ethan? I'm sure you're about to tell me. You're so used to being treated like you don't matter that you've forgotten how to work with people who do." Ethan felt that land like a punch. "That's not fair." "Maybe not, but it's true." Victoria sat down across from him. "You're brilliant. You see things other people miss, but you can't do this alone. You need the team on your side, and right now you're pushing them away." "Oh, Robert's the one who's been freezing me out since day one." "I know, and I'll deal with Robert, but you need to meet them halfway. You can't just drop reports and expect everyone to fall in line. You need to bring people with you." Ethan looked down at his hands. "I don't know how to do that." "Then learn." She pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. "There's a conference next month in Denver. Grid infrastructure and emergency protocols. I'm sending you and Robert together." Ethan's head snapped up. "You're joking." "Do I look like I'm joking? That's a terrible idea." "Probably. But you two need to figure out how to work together, and I'm not going to babysit you through it. So you're going to spend 3 days at a conference, attend some panels, and have actual conversations that don't involve me mediating. Maybe you'll kill each other. Maybe you'll come back with a functional working relationship. Either way, it'll be resolved." Ethan stared at her. "You're serious?" "Completely." He took the folder, feeling like he'd just been handed a live grenade. "This is going to be a disaster." "Then make sure it's an interesting disaster." Victoria stood up, signaling the conversation was over. "And Ethan, stop acting like you're still a janitor. You're not. You're a systems architect with full authority to audit this company's infrastructure. Start acting like it." Ethan left her office feeling more confused than when he'd entered. He was supposed to be confident but collaborative, assertive but respectful. He was supposed to trust the team but also not wait for permission. It felt like being asked to solve an equation with no solution. That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with Chloe, helping her with her math homework. She was working on multiplication, and she kept getting frustrated when she couldn't figure out the answers fast enough. "I'm bad at this." "You're not bad at it. You're learning." "Everyone else is faster." "Everyone else isn't you." She looked up at him. "That doesn't make sense. It means you don't have to be like everyone else. You just have to figure out what works for you." Chloe frowned. "Is this about math or something else?" Ethan smiled. "Little bit of both." She went back to her homework, and Ethan sat there watching her, thinking about what Victoria had said. Maybe he didn't have to be like everyone else either. Maybe he just had to figure out what worked for him. The flight to Denver was awkward from the moment they boarded. Ethan had his laptop bag slung over one shoulder, a carry-on that had seen better days, and a boarding pass that put him in seat 14A. He found his row, shoved his bag into the overhead compartment, and sat down by the window. 2 minutes later, Robert appeared in the aisle, checked his ticket, and looked at the empty seat next to Ethan with an expression that suggested he'd just been asked to sit next to a live skunk. "You've got to be kidding me." Ethan didn't look up from his phone. "Victoria booked the flights." "Of course she did." Robert sat down heavily, his jaw tight, and immediately pulled out his own phone. For the next 20 minutes, neither of them said a word. The plane filled up around them, people shuffling bags and settling in, and the silence between Ethan and Robert felt thick enough to cut. When the flight attendant came by to check seatbelts, she smiled at them. "You two traveling together?" "No." Robert said. At the same time, Ethan said, "Unfortunately." The flight attendant's smile faltered slightly, and she moved on. Once they were in the air, Ethan pulled out his laptop and opened a file he'd been working on. System diagnostics. Load distribution models. The kind of thing that made his brain feel useful. Robert glanced over. "You always work on planes." When I can't avoid sitting next to someone who hates me, yeah. Robert's jaw tightened. "I don't hate you. Could have fooled me. I just think you're handling this the wrong way." Ethan closed his laptop and turned to look at him. "Handling what the wrong way?" "This whole thing. You come in, bypass everyone, go straight to Victoria with every problem you find, and then act surprised when people don't trust you." "I'm not trying to bypass anyone. I'm trying to do my job. You get Your job is to work with the team, not around it." Ethan felt his frustration building. "I sent you a report. You ignored it. I was evaluating it. For a week, while system inefficiencies kept running. You want me to collaborate? Fine. But don't act like I'm the problem when you're the one sitting on fixes because your ego can't handle someone new pointing out flaws." Robert's face flushed. "My ego? You've been there a month and you're already acting like you're the only person who knows what they're doing. Maybe that's because I'm the only person who's actually finding problems. Or maybe you're just looking for ways to make yourself indispensable so Victoria doesn't realize hiring you was a mistake." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and mean. Ethan turned away and stared out the window at the clouds below. His hands were shaking slightly, but he kept them still in his lap. "You don't know anything about me," he said quietly. Robert didn't respond. They didn't speak for the rest of the flight. The conference was held at a massive hotel in downtown Denver, the kind of place with chandeliers in the lobby and carpets that probably cost more than Ethan's car. Registration was a mess of people in business casual, name tags, and overly enthusiastic volunteers pointing people toward different conference rooms. Ethan picked up his badge and schedule, and Robert did the same. They stood there in the lobby, surrounded by strangers, neither of them making eye contact. Finally, Robert said, "There's a panel on grid failure protocols at 2. You going?" "Yeah." "I'll see you there then." He walked off before Ethan could respond. Ethan found his room on the 8th floor, dropped his bag on the bed, and sat down heavily. The room was nice. Way nicer than anywhere he'd stayed in years. Clean sheets, a view of the mountains, a coffee maker that actually worked. He pulled out his phone and called Chloe. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice bright. "Dad, ba." "Hey kiddo, how's it going?" "Good. Mrs. Kim made me soup. It's weird, but it's good." Ethan smiled despite himself. "What kind of soup?" "I don't know. She said a name, but I can't say it." "Well, as long as it's not poisoning you, I'm okay with it." "When are you coming home?" "Friday. 3 more days. That's forever. It'll go fast." "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Sure, but..." "Are you happy now? Like, with your job?" "No?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know yet, kiddo. I'm still figuring it out. But it's better than cleaning, right?" "Yeah, it's better than cleaning." "Good. I don't want you to be sad anymore." Ethan's chest tightened. "I'm not sad." "You were, though, before. I could tell." He didn't know what to say to that. Chloe was 8 years old, and she'd seen through every lie he'd tried to tell her about being okay. "I love you, kiddo." "Love you too. Don't forget to eat vegetables." "Oh, I'll try." After he hung up, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. Chloe was right. He had been sad, for years, and he thought he was hiding it well enough that she wouldn't notice. But kids always noticed. The panel on grid failure protocols was held in a conference room packed with engineers, analysts, and consultants who all looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Ethan found a seat near the back and pulled out his notebook. Robert was already there, sitting 3 rows ahead, not looking in Ethan's direction. The panel consisted of 4 experts discussing redundancy planning, emergency shutdown sequences, and disaster recovery strategies. It was exactly the kind of technical deep dive Ethan loved, and he took notes furiously, his brain lighting up with ideas. Halfway through, one of the panelists, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes, Brought up a case study about a grid failure in the Pacific Northwest that had been caused by a synchronization conflict between cooling systems and load balancers. Ethan's head snapped up. That was almost exactly what he'd found at Vanguard. The panelist walked through the timeline of the failure, explaining how the problem had gone undetected for months because the monitoring systems weren't designed to catch that specific type of conflict. When it finally triggered, it caused a cascade failure that took down power for nearly 2 million people for 16 hours. Ethan's stomach turned. That could have been Vanguard. That could have been the Midwest. When the panel ended and people started filtering out, Ethan stayed in his seat, staring at his notes. He felt sick. If he hadn't heard that sound in the cooling system, if he hadn't gone into the server room that night, millions of people could have lost power. Hospitals, traffic systems, everything. He'd stopped it without even realizing how close it had been. Someone sat down next to him. Ethan looked over and found Robert, his expression unreadable. "You were right," Robert said quietly. Ethan blinked. "What?" "That shutdown flaw you found. If that had triggered, it would have been exactly like what they just described. Cascade failure, days of recovery. You saved us from that." Ethan didn't know what to say. Robert rubbed his face, looking tired. "I've been doing this for 20 years, and I missed it. You were there a month, and you caught it. That's not luck. That's skill." "I was just doing my job." "No, you were doing more than that." Robert paused. "Look, I've been a jerk to you since you started. I know that. And it's not because I think you're incompetent. It's because I spent 3 years building that team, and then Victoria hired someone without asking me, and it felt like she didn't trust us to handle things ourselves." Ethan nodded slowly. "I get that. But I was wrong. You're good at this, really good. And I should have been helping you instead of trying to prove you didn't belong." "You weren't completely wrong, though. I don't know how to work with a team. I've been alone for so long I forgot how to do it any other way." Robert looked at him. "Then maybe we both need to figure it out." Ethan felt something shift. Not friendship exactly, but maybe the beginning of respect. "Yeah, maybe." They sat there for a moment longer, the conference room emptying around them. Then Robert stood up. "There's a reception tonight, open bar. You want to grab a drink and pretend this conversation wasn't completely awkward?" Ethan smiled. "Sure." The reception was held in a ballroom with too many people and not enough space, and was held in a chasse. Ethan and Robert found a spot near the bar and ordered drinks, then stood off to the side watching the crowd. "I hate these things," Robert said, taking a sip of his whiskey. "Same. Too much small talk. Everyone pretending they're more important than they are." "You sound like you've been to a lot of conferences." "Too many. After a while, they all blend together." Ethan nodded. He'd been to a few conferences back when he was at Helix, and he remembered the same feeling. The forced networking, the business cards, the conversations that felt like performances. "Can I ask you something?" Robert said. "Sure." "What happened at Helix? I know the official story, but I want to hear it from you." Ethan took a long drink of his beer. "I found evidence that someone was manipulating billing data, skimming fractions of a % off energy charges across dozens of municipalities. It added up to millions. I reported it, and 2 weeks later I was fired." "Did they ever investigate?" "Internally, yeah. They found nothing. Or they said they found nothing. Either way, my name got blacklisted, and I couldn't get hired anywhere." "So you ended up cleaning floors?" "Yeah." Robert was quiet for a moment. "That's messed up." "It is what it is." "No, I mean it. You did the right thing, and they destroyed you for it. That's not okay." Ethan shrugged. "The world's not fair. Doesn't mean we have to accept it." They stood there in silence, watching people network and laugh and pretend everything was great. Then Robert said, "For what it's worth, I'm glad Victoria hired you, even if I didn't show it." Ethan looked at him, surprised. "Thanks. And I'm sorry I made your first month hell." "You didn't make it hell. You just made it harder than it needed to be." Robert smiled slightly. "Fair enough." They stayed at the reception for another hour, talking about work and systems and the things they'd both learned over the years. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it felt like the start of something that could be. When Ethan finally got back to his room, it was past midnight. He collapsed onto the bed, exhausted but also lighter than he'd felt in weeks. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. "How's Denver?" Ethan typed back. "Better than expected." Her response came quickly. "Good. Don't screw it up." He smiled and set his phone down. The next 2 days of the conference were easier. Ethan and Robert attended panels together, grabbed meals, and actually talked about the systems they were working on without it turning into an argument. They didn't agree on everything, but they were listening to each other, and that felt like progress. On the last day, there was a keynote speech by a former government energy advisor who talked about the future of smart infrastructure and the importance of redundancy planning. Ethan took notes, his mind already racing with ideas for how to apply some of the concepts back at Vanguard. When the conference ended, he and Robert stood in the lobby waiting for their ride to the airport. "You think Victoria's going to ask how it went?" Robert said. "Definitely." "What are you going to tell her, what?" Ethan thought about it. "That we didn't kill each other." Robert laughed. "Low bar, but accurate." The car arrived, and they loaded their bags and climbed in. On the way to the airport, Robert turned to Ethan. "When we get back, I want to set up a weekly meeting. You, me, Maya, and a couple others. Go through system audits together. Make it collaborative instead of you finding stuff and dropping reports on us." Ethan nodded. "I'd like that." "Good. Because if we're going to do this, we need to do it right." They spent the flight back going over notes from the conference, bouncing ideas off each other. And by the time they landed in Chicago, Ethan felt like something had fundamentally shifted. He wasn't an outsider anymore. He was part of the team. When Ethan got home Friday night, Chloe was waiting by the door. "Dad!" She threw her arms around him and he picked her up even though she was getting too big for it. "Miss me?" "So much. Mrs. Kim made me eat vegetables every night." "Good." "It was terrible." Ethan set her down and ruffled her hair. "How was school?" "Boring. How was your trip?" "Not boring." "Did you and the mean guy become friends?" Ethan smiled. "He's not mean. And yeah, kind of." "Good. You need friends." "I have friends." "No, you don't." She wasn't wrong. That weekend, Ethan took Chloe to buy new shoes like he'd promised. They went to a store in a nicer part of town, the kind of place he used to walk past because everything was too expensive. Chloe tried on 6 different pairs, walking up and down the aisle in each one, before finally settling on a pair of bright blue sneakers with white laces. "These ones." "You sure?" "Positive." Ethan looked at the price tag and didn't flinch. A month ago, he would have steered her toward the clearance section, but now he could afford it. At the register, the cashier rang them up and Ethan handed over his card without hesitation. Chloe carried the shoebox out of the store like it was treasure, and when they got back to the apartment, she put them on immediately and refused to take them off, even inside. "Dad, look how fast I can run now, She sprinted from one end of the tiny living room to the other, grinning. Ethan watched her and felt something crack open in his chest. This was what he'd been fighting for. Not the job, not the respect, not even the money. This. Her smile. Her excitement over a pair of shoes. That night, after Chloe went to bed, Ethan sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. He had an email from Victoria waiting. Subject, Monday morning. He opened it. "I want a full report on Denver. What you learned, what you think we should implement, and how things are with Robert. My office, 9 a.m. Also, good work." Ethan read the last line 3 times. Good work. 2 words. But they mattered more than Victoria probably realized. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in 3 years, Ethan Ryder felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. On Monday morning, Ethan walked into Victoria's office with a folder full of notes and ideas from the conference. She was at her desk, typing something on her computer, and gestured for him to sit without looking up. "Give me a minute." Ethan sat and waited, watching her work. She had the kind of focus that made the rest of the world disappear. He recognized it because he used to be the same way. Finally, she closed her laptop and turned her attention to him. "How was Denver?" "Productive." That's not an answer. Ethan smiled. "Robert and I worked some things out. We're on the same page now." Good, that's what I was hoping for. You could have just told us to talk instead of forcing us to spend 3 days together. Where's the fun in that? Ethan shook his head. You're kind of manipulative, you know that? I prefer strategic. Victoria leaned back in her chair. What did you learn? Ethan walked her through the panels he'd attended, the case studies he'd heard, and the ideas he had for improving Vanguard's systems. She listened carefully, asking questions, pushing back on a few points, nodding at others. When he finished, she tapped her fingers on the desk. I want you to present this to the engineering team. Full presentation. Make it collaborative. You sure that's a good idea? Why wouldn't it be? Because a month ago, half of them wanted me gone. And now? Ethan thought about the weekly meetings Robert had suggested, about Maya stopping by his desk to ask questions, about the way people had started actually listening when he spoke up. Now it's different. Exactly. So present your ideas, get their input, build something together. Ethan nodded. Okay. Victoria stood up, signaling the meeting was over. But before Ethan could leave, she said, one more thing. He turned back. There's going to be a board meeting next month. I want you there. Why? Because you're going to present the work you've been doing. Show them what you've found. Explain why it matters. Ethan felt his stomach drop. I don't do well with board meetings. You'll be fine. Victoria, last time I presented something important to people in power, I got fired. Her expression softened slightly. I'm not Helix, Ethan, and I'm not going to let anyone tear you down for doing your job. Trust me. He wanted to. He really did. He wanted. But trust was hard when the last time he'd given it, it had destroyed his life. Still, he nodded. Okay. Good, now get out of here. You've got work to do. Ethan left her office and headed back to his desk, his mind already racing. A board presentation, in front of investors and executives who'd spent their entire careers in rooms like that. He'd spent the last 3 years pushing a mop. This was going to be a disaster. But as he sat down at his desk and opened his laptop, he thought about what Victoria had said. Trust me. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan thought maybe he could. The morning of the board meeting, Ethan woke up at 4:30 and couldn't fall back asleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind running through the presentation he'd rehearsed a dozen times, finding new ways it could fall apart. What if they didn't believe him? What if they thought he was exaggerating the risks? What if someone on this board had connections to Helix and knew about the whistleblower complaint? What if this was all a setup? At 5:15, he gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen, made coffee, stared at his notes, rewrote a slide he'd already rewritten 3 times. Chloe shuffled out of her room at 6, rubbing her eyes. Why are you up? Couldn't sleep. Because of the important meeting? Ethan looked at her, surprised. How'd you know about that? You've been talking about it all week. You get this look on your face when you're worried. What look? Like you're trying to solve a really hard math problem, but you think you're going to get it wrong. Ethan smiled despite himself. That's pretty accurate. Chloe climbed onto the chair next to him and looked at his laptop screen. What's a cascade failure? It's when one problem causes another problem, and that causes another, until everything breaks. Like dominoes? Exactly like dominoes. But you stopped it, right? Yeah. Then why are you worried? Ethan closed his laptop. Because I have to explain it to a bunch of people who might not believe me. Chloe frowned. Why wouldn't they believe you? Because sometimes people don't listen to the person saying something. They only listen to who's saying it. That's dumb. Yeah, kiddo, it is. She reached over and patted his hand. You'll be okay. You're really smart, remember? Ethan felt his throat tighten. Thanks. Can I have waffles? Yeah, you can have waffles. By 8:30, Ethan was standing outside the Vanguard building in a suit he'd bought 2 days ago at a discount store. It fit better than the thrift store clothes, but he still felt like he was wearing a costume. He took a breath and walked inside. Victoria was already in the conference room on the 12th floor, setting up the projector. She looked up when he entered. You're early. Couldn't wait around anymore. Nervous? Terrified. Victoria smiled slightly. Good. It means you care. She gestured to the screen. Run through your slides one more time. Make sure everything works. Ethan connected his laptop and pulled up the presentation. 43 slides, graphs, data models, diagrams showing the synchronization conflicts he'd found and the fixes he'd implemented. It looked professional, thorough. He still felt like he was about to throw up. At 9 o'clock, the board members started arriving. 7 people, all older, all wearing suits that probably cost more than Ethan's rent. They took seats around the long conference table, talking quietly to each other, barely acknowledging Ethan's presence. Victoria sat at the head of the table. Thank you all for coming. Before we get into quarterly financials, I want to introduce Ethan Ryder, our senior systems architect. He's going to present some critical findings about our infrastructure. One of the board members, a man in his 60s with silver hair and an expression that suggested he'd already made up his mind about everything, looked at Ethan. How long have you been with the company, Mr. Ryder? 2 months, Ian. The man's eyebrows went up slightly. And you're presenting to the board already? He found flaws in our system that could have caused a multi-state blackout, Victoria said evenly. I'd say that warrants a presentation. The man sat back, clearly unconvinced. Ethan stepped up to the front of the room, his hands shaking slightly. He clicked to the first slide. Over the past 6 weeks, I've conducted a comprehensive audit of Vanguard's grid infrastructure. What I found was a series of vulnerabilities that, if triggered under the right conditions, could result in catastrophic failure. He walked them through it step by step. The cooling system synchronization conflict, the emergency shutdown flaw, the redundancy protocols running inefficiently. Each slide was backed by data, simulations, real-world case studies from other grid failures. The board members listened, some taking notes, others just watching. When Ethan got to the slide showing the potential impact of a cascade failure, one of the women on the board leaned forward. You're saying we were at risk of causing a blackout affecting 6 states? Yes. And our monitoring systems didn't catch it? No. The flaw was in a subsystem that doesn't get audited regularly. It would have stayed hidden until it triggered. The silver-haired man spoke up again. This sounds alarmist. We've been operating this infrastructure for 5 years without incident. Ethan met his eyes. The Pacific Northwest grid operated for 7 years before a similar synchronization conflict caused a blackout that affected 2 million people for 16 hours. It wasn't alarmist. It was inevitable. But you fixed it. Yes. So why are we hearing about this now instead of 2 months ago? Ethan felt his frustration rising. Because I wanted to make sure the fixes were stable before presenting them. And because I thought the board should know how close we came to a disaster. The man looked at Victoria. Is this really necessary? It sounds like the problem's been resolved. Victoria's expression was cool. The problem was resolved because Ethan found it. If he hadn't, we'd be dealing with lawsuits, regulatory investigations, and a company reputation in ruins. So yes, I think it's necessary. The room went quiet. Another board member, a younger woman in her 40s, looked at Ethan. What's your recommendation moving forward? What? Ethan clicked to his final slide. I recommend implementing a quarterly audit protocol for all subsystems, not just primary infrastructure. I also recommend expanding the monitoring software to flag synchronization conflicts across all integrated systems. And I recommend cross-training the engineering team so more people understand how these systems interact. That's going to be expensive, the silver-haired man said. It's cheaper than a blackout. The woman nodded. I agree with Mr. Ryder. This is exactly the kind of proactive work we should be doing. The rest of the board murmured agreement, and Ethan felt the tension in his chest ease slightly. Victoria stood up. Thank you, Ethan. Excellent work. He gathered his laptop and left the room, his legs barely holding him up. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall and took a long breath. He'd done it. He'd stood in front of people with power and told them the truth, and they'd listened. The door opened, and Victoria stepped out. You okay? Yeah, just processing. You did well in there. The silver-haired guy hated me. That's Richard. He hates everyone. Don't take it personally. Ethan laughed, the sound shaky. I thought I was going to pass out. You didn't, and you made a strong case. Victoria paused. There's something else. Ethan looked at her. I got a call last week from a federal investigator. They've been building a case against Helix Energy Solutions for the past 18 months. The evidence you submitted 3 years ago was part of what triggered it. Ethan's heart stopped. What? They're filing charges, fraud, falsification of records, multiple counts. The executive who had you fired is going to prison. Ethan stared at her, his mind refusing to process what she'd just said. They're actually charging them? Yes, and they want you to testify. I don't... Ethan's voice cracked. I don't know if I can do that. You don't have to, but the investigator said your testimony would help, and it would officially clear your name. Ethan sat down on the floor, right there in the hallway, because his legs gave out. For 3 years, he'd believed that telling the truth had destroyed his life, that doing the right thing had cost him everything and changed nothing. But it hadn't changed nothing. It had just taken longer than he thought. Victoria sat down next to him. You were right, Ethan, the whole time, and now everyone's going to know it. Ethan put his head in his hands and tried not to cry. 2 weeks later, Ethan sat in a federal building in downtown Chicago, waiting to be called into a conference room where investigators wanted to ask him questions about Helix. His lawyer, a sharp woman in her 50s who Victoria had insisted on paying for, sat next to him reviewing notes. Just answer their questions honestly. Don't volunteer extra information. If you don't know something, say you don't know. You'll be fine. Ethan nodded, his throat dry. When they called him in, he sat across from 2 investigators and a federal prosecutor who looked like she'd been doing this job for 20 years and had stopped being impressed by anything a long time ago. They asked him about the billing discrepancies he'd found, about the reports he'd filed, about the meetings with his supervisor in compliance. Ethan answered everything as clearly as he could, pulling up old emails and documents he'd saved on an external drive he'd kept hidden for years, just in case. The prosecutor looked at him when he finished. Why didn't you come forward again after you were fired, Bet? Because nobody believed me the first time. I didn't think anyone would believe me the second time either. But you kept the evidence. Yeah. Why? Ethan thought about that. Because I wanted to believe it mattered, even if nobody was listening. The prosecutor nodded slowly. It did matter, Mr. Ryder. Your complaint is part of what led us here. Thank you. When Ethan left the building 2 hours later, he felt lighter than he had in years. The truth had survived. It had taken 3 years, cost him everything, and almost broken him. But it had survived. At work, things continued to shift in ways Ethan hadn't expected. Robert started including him in strategy meetings. Maya asked for his input on a project she was leading. Even the people who'd been skeptical at first were starting to treat him like he belonged. One afternoon, Victoria called him into her office. Sit. Ethan sat, bracing himself for whatever was coming. Victoria slid a folder across the desk. That's your performance review. I've only been here 3 months. I know. Open it. Ethan opened the folder and stared at the number at the bottom. A raise. A significant one. Victoria, this is fair. You found flaws that saved this company millions of dollars in potential damages. You've improved system efficiency by 15%, and you've started building trust with a team that didn't want you here. That's worth compensating. Ethan looked at her. Well, why are you doing this? Because you're good at what you do, and I'm not interested in losing you. I'm not going anywhere. Good. Because I'm also promoting you to lead systems architect. You'll oversee all infrastructure audits moving forward. Ethan felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Ethan felt like the floor. Robert's not going to like that. Robert suggested it. What? Victoria smiled. He came to me last week and said you should be leading audits instead of him. Said you see things he doesn't. That was a direct quote. Ethan sat back, stunned. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Yes. Good. Now get out of here. I have actual work to do. Ethan stood up, still holding the folder, still trying to process what had just happened. At the door, he turned back. Victoria? Yeah? Thank you for taking a chance on me. She looked at him for a long moment. I didn't take a chance, Ethan. I made a smart business decision. There's a difference. But the way she said it, he knew there was more to it than that. That night, Ethan took Chloe out to dinner at a restaurant that wasn't fast food. They sat in a booth by the window, and she ordered chicken fingers and fries like it was the fanciest meal she'd ever had. Dad, this place is nice. Yeah. Can we come here again? Whenever you want. She looked at him seriously. Are we rich now? Ethan laughed. No, kiddo, we're not rich, but we're doing okay. Better than okay? Yeah, better than okay. Chloe smiled and took a bite of her chicken. Good. I like better than okay. After dinner, they walked through downtown Chicago, just the two of them. The city was lit up, people everywhere, and for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel invisible. He felt present. He felt like himself. 3 months later, Ethan stood in a new apartment on the north side of Chicago. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with appliances that worked, windows that didn't leak cold air. A living room big enough for Chloe to actually run around in. She was in her new room, unpacking boxes and talking to herself about where to put everything. Ethan stood in the doorway watching her, feeling something he had almost forgotten how to feel. Gratitude. Not for the apartment or the money or the job, for the fact that he'd survived, that he'd kept going even when everything told him to give up, that he'd been right and the world had finally caught up. Chloe looked over at him. Dad, can we paint my room blue? We can paint it whatever color you want. Really? Really? She grinned and went back to unpacking. Ethan's phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. Dinner tomorrow? There's something I want to discuss. He typed back. Sure. What time? 7. I'll send you the address. Ethan stared at the message for a moment, curious. Victoria didn't do casual dinners. If she wanted to meet outside the office, it meant something. The next night, Ethan met Victoria at a quiet restaurant in the West Loop. She was already there, sitting at a corner table with a glass of wine. You're late. Traffic. Sit. Ethan sat, feeling like this was some kind of test he didn't know he was taking. Victoria set down her glass. I wanted to talk to you about something outside of work. Okay? I've been thinking a lot about what happened to you, about how the system failed you, and I keep coming back to the same question, which is, how many other people are out there like you? Smart, capable, doing the right thing, and getting destroyed for it? Ethan didn't know what to say. Victoria leaned forward. I want to start a program. A fund, maybe. Something that helps people who've been blacklisted for whistleblowing. Legal support, job placement, financial assistance while they rebuild. I want you to help me design it. Ethan stared at her. Why me? Because you lived it. You know what people need. And I think you'd be good at identifying who deserves help and who's just looking for a handout. Victoria, I don't know anything about running a program like that. Neither do I. We'll figure it out together. Ethan sat back, his mind racing. This is going to be expensive. I have money. I'd rather spend it on something that matters. And you think this matters? Victoria looked at him seriously. I think the world punishes honesty, and that's wrong. I can't fix the whole system. But maybe I can help a few people who got caught in it. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Yeah, okay, I'll help. Good. Victoria picked up her glass. Now, let's eat. I'm starving. They spent the rest of dinner talking about logistics, ideas, how to structure the program so it actually helped people instead of becoming another bureaucratic mess. And for the first time, Ethan realized that what had happened to him hadn't just been survival. It had been preparation. 6 months after Ethan started at Vanguard, he stood in his new office overlooking downtown Chicago. The same view he used to clean at night, back when he was invisible. Now he had a title, a team, a purpose. On his desk was a framed photo of Chloe, grinning in her bright blue sneakers. Next to it was an email he'd printed out, a message from someone who'd been helped by the whistleblower assistance program Victoria had launched. A woman who'd lost her job for reporting safety violations at a manufacturing plant and had spent 2 years unemployed before the program helped her find work again. The email ended with a simple line. Thank you for not giving up. Ethan read it every morning. Because there had been so many moments when he'd wanted to give up, when he'd thought about just disappearing, when the weight of keeping Chloe safe and fed and happy while his own life fell apart had felt like too much to carry. But he hadn't given up. And somehow, that had mattered. The door to his office opened and Robert stuck his head in. "You coming to the meeting?" "Yeah, be there in a minute." Robert left and Ethan stood at the window for a moment longer, looking out at the city. He thought about the man he used to be, the engineer who thought doing the right thing would be enough, who believed the system worked, who trusted that honesty mattered. That man had been naive, but he hadn't been wrong. Honesty did matter. The system didn't always work, but that didn't mean you stopped trying. And sometimes, the right thing cost you everything before it gave you anything back. Ethan had lost his career, his reputation, and years of his life. But he'd kept his integrity. And in the end, that had been the only thing worth keeping. He turned away from the window and walked out of his office, back into the world where people saw him, where his voice mattered, where the work he did meant something. He wasn't invisible anymore. And that made every terrible thing he'd survived worth it. Because the world tried to erase him. But the right person finally saw his value before it was too late. And that had changed everything.